January 1925. In Northwest Alaska, a legend was born. Gunnar Carson and his team of dogs, led by Balto, had braved the frozen wilderness to save a small, isolated town from a deadly outbreak of diphtheria. Their mission became a media sensation.
All these elements of drama, of uncertainty played into this. What are people imagining Alaska to be? And what are people imagining this journey to be like?
There's a lot of unanswered questions. And stories tend to get better, I've learned, as the years go by.
The story begins in Nome. Once a gold mining mecca with a population of 20,000, it was now a fading frontier town of fewer than 1,000. Located 160 miles east of Siberia on the edge of the Bering Sea. With no roads in or out, it was, for much of the year, completely cut off from the rest of the world.
Oh, the winters. It's 7 months long. All transportation on the water ceases. The Bering Sea, and the rivers start to freeze up. The last boat would leave in October.
Along Nome's front street stood the Miners and Merchants Bank. The top floor was the home of the town's only doctor, Curtis Welsh. For months, Dr. Welsh and his wife Lula had been troubled by the recent deaths of children. There were 2 in the autumn. And then, 7-year-old Margaret Ida fell ill on Christmas Day. She died 3 days later. Then word came that a 4th child was dead. Billy Barnett, the infant son of a local mine official. Welsh had diagnosed all 4 cases as tonsillitis, but now he feared it was something worse. For 3 days, Dr. Welsh and his wife told no one of their suspicions. But then came news from his nurse. A 5th child, an Eskimo girl, was seriously ill. Welch immediately bundled up and headed out into the cold. The Eskimos of Nome lived on the Sand Spit, a sliver of land jutting out into the Bering Sea on the outskirts of town.
Nome in the 1920s, racially segregated. There were separate restaurants, bars, schools. Alaska Natives weren't allowed to live in the boundaries of Nome. So it was considered to be a healthier option than living with Nome whites.
Once on the Sand Spit, Welch entered a tiny one-room shack. As he peered into the mouth of his 6-year-old patient, he realized he could no longer hide his fears. Later that same day, an emergency meeting of the city council was called. Huddled in a small office on Front Street, a handful of Nome's prominent citizens listened intently as the doctor spoke. The town, he declared, was facing an outbreak of diphtheria.
This was an extremely contagious respiratory kind of a disease. Symptoms for diphtheria, extremely high fever, very, very sore throat to the point where it's constricting your breathing and you have trouble swallowing.
There was only one known cure, serum, or antitoxin, made from horse's blood.
Dr. Welch, he went to see how much serum he had, but he only had a small amount, and certainly not enough for more than a few people.
But it was worse than that. The batch had expired 5 years earlier. Welch told the assembled men that he was too scared to use it. By the morning of January 22nd, the town of Nome had essentially shut down.
They closed everything down, all the public libraries, schools. You couldn't have any visitors, and you couldn't go out of the house.
We were super cautious and apprehensive. I remember my sister Helen and I, we would go by a house that had been quarantined, and the quarantine was posted on the door, great big red card. And we would hold our breath and walk real fast or run past that house.
Nome's mayor was George Maynard. He was also the owner and publisher of the town's only newspaper, the weekly Nome Nugget. Deeply worried, Maynard put the outbreak on the front page. Soon, fearful residents began streaming into the small hospital with symptoms both real and imagined. By day 3, Welch had 6 patients in his care who showed signs of diphtheria. Fearing there were no other options available, he began to privately administer experimental doses of the expired serum to a native patient. Welch had sent an urgent telegram to the nation's top health authority in Washington, D.C. Now, Nome could only wait while government officials scrambled to locate shipments of serum that could be redirected to Alaska. Then, on day 5 of the epidemic, came news that antitoxin was discovered at a hospital in Anchorage, 1,000 miles away. It was only a small amount, barely enough to cure a handful of people, but it could still possibly keep the epidemic at bay until a larger shipment could be found. The question was, how to get the serum to Nome.
I think about that time, airplanes started to come over, the original World War I planes. I remember one time this biplane came in and circled over, and everybody in town went out there, and the plane went around and around and looked over the field good before he came into land.
Aviation fever was sweeping the country. But in Alaska, there were only a handful of aviators willing to brave the treacherous conditions. Most were based in the small town of Fairbanks. The town had established a small aviation business, the Fairbanks Airplane Corporation, funded in part by the town's merchants and businessmen. But the company's biggest booster, and one of its founders, was the bigger-than-life editor of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, William Fentress Thompson.
The most dynamic newspaper man that has ever been here was W.F. Thompson. Thompson was prone to exaggeration, prone to overconfidence, and tireless promoter of Fairbanks and aviation. So he saw a future for the community. They were past the gold rush era. They were in the age of the Roaring '20s. This was the time in which, Alaska was going to be modernized.
Thompson envisioned flying the serum to Nome in just 2 days. But no one had ever flown across the interior in the dead of winter.
It was a risky business. Instruments were minimal. You had a compass and goggles.
These are aircraft that are built out of wood and fabric and basically piano wire. So they really weren't much more than like a dog sled with a big engine on the front of it and wings.
Upon learning of Nome's plight, Thompson immediately ordered one of his planes, an open cockpit standard biplane, to be dragged out of storage. But Thompson would need approval from what he called the federal bunch. The federal government's representative in the territory was the governor, Scott C. Bone.
Public Health Service, that's Bone's responsibility. And so the challenge was, can we get the serum over to Nome in time? Transportation by dog team is reliable, but how long is it going to take?
The mail run used to take 30 days because the teams in those days would run about 30 miles, and they had roadhouses, and you'd pull in, they'd put the dogs in the barn, and then the next day you'd take off again.
Speed is of the essence. That's the advantage of the airplane. But Bone didn't trust the airplane, and he sees Thompson as nothing more than an irresponsible irritant out there.
The governor decided to go with the dogs. Bone proposed to transport the serum as far north as possible by train, and then a non-stop dog sled relay would ferry the serum night and day across 700 miles of postal trail. Down in Anchorage, the serum was bundled securely and handed to a conductor waiting aboard an express train.
They've got this serum packed in these little glass bottles, wrapped in a quilt, very carefully insulated, because these little glass bottles of serum could not freeze.
The starting point would be the tiny village of Nenana, the last stop on the Alaskan Railway. From Nenana, the trail followed the westward flowing Tanana and Yukon rivers. The last stretch wound its way up the coast around the frozen Norton Sound and into Nome. At 9 p.m. on the evening of January 27th, the train chuffed into Nenana. Temperatures in the interior were reaching record lows. Waiting at the station was William Shannon, the first musher in the run. He was a part-time mail driver with a reputation for hard drinking, earning him the nickname Wild Bill. In Fairbanks, Thompson still fought for his plan. In that evening's edition of the Daily News Miner, he lashed out.
Governor Bone has evidently taken charge and has ordered the antitoxin sent to Nome by dog team. Fairbanks must sit by the fire, envisioning Nome babies and the pioneering parents strangling and dying the most horrible deaths. Should conflicting authorities change their mind, Fairbanks is standing by, ready with airships and men to cut Nome's waiting time in half.
Wild Bill strapped the precious 20-pound bundle to his sled. Then, with a shout to his 9 dogs, he took off. Wild Bill disappeared into the darkness. In Nome, early the next morning, in a small kennel towards the outskirts of town, one man was awake, readying his team of dogs. Leonard Seppala, an immigrant from Norway, worked as a musher for the Hammond Consolidated Gold Mining Company. But he was also a racing champion, once referred to as the king of the trail.
Leonard Seppala was always competitive. That's what drove him. And he loved the spotlight.
Seppala used Siberian huskies. People call them Siberian rats because they were so small compared to these 150-pound Malamutes that were out there pulling these massive sleds.
Seppala was to take his best team and head east down the trail for 300 miles until he reached the village of Nulado. There he would meet the relay of mushers heading west and turn around to deliver the life-saving serum to Nome. The 600-mile round-trip journey would be daunting to most mushers, but Seppala relished the challenge. That morning, Seppala didn't hesitate to select as his lead a 12-year-old dog named Togo.
In a lifetime of driving dogs, you'll have a great leader. You'll have one dog that will excel. Togo was Leonard Seppala's greatest dog.
As Seppala and his team were leaving Nome, Wild Bill was making his way west. He had had a long, tough night. The Yukon interior is one of the 2 coldest points in the northern hemisphere, colder than the Arctic itself. As Wild Bill followed the trail along the bank of the Tanana River, the temperature dropped to 54 below.
Nobody moves through that kind of weather. No animal, no creature, nobody goes anywhere. There's an enemy without. And if you let him in, through your park or through your mucklucks or whatever it might be, you've let a real enemy in, and it could destroy you.
By morning, the bitter cold had taken its toll. Wild Bill's team of 9 was reduced to 6 by the time he handed off the serum to the next musher. In Nome, the situation had grown more dire. By now, Dr. Welsh had tried the expired serum on several patients, and their conditions seemed to improve. But there were 5 new suspected cases in just 2 days. In the midst of all this, George Maynard, as both mayor and editor of the local paper, wrote a simple but pointed dispatch and sent it out to the Associated Press. "There is only one physician here, and new cases are appearing daily," he wrote. The story was immediately picked up by dozens of papers.
You had the mayor of Nome sending out a reasonably terse and factual report. There was a need for the serum, and there was a sled run that was going to get the serum from point A to point B. All of those things are true. But now it reaches the media in the lower 48. The race against time, is one of the oldest and hoariest cliches. But you layer on top of that this other element of Alaska itself, well, it's no wonder that this grows.
There had been generations of epidemics, a lot of Alaska Natives dying. But I think white America looked at Native populations within a historic framework. Native peoples are supposed to be vanishing, so another wave of epidemics is tragic, but somehow natural. But the reason why the story mattered was it was happening to white children.
Across the Yukon Valley, word of the relay spread rapidly from one signal corps cabin to the next. all of the next mushers in the interior would be half or full-blooded Koyukuk or Yukon Indian. They were mostly young men with an unparalleled stamina, forged from the daily struggle to survive the long sub-zero winters. After Wild Bill, 20-year-old Edgar Callens, a part-time mail driver for the Northern Commercial Company, made the 31-mile journey to Manly Hot Springs. Later that day, Johnny Folger carried it from Fish Lake. Overnight, the serum was in the hands of Sam Joseph, who descended from the fiercest tribe in the region. Harry Pitka, who had lost a dozen siblings to a previous epidemic of tuberculosis, picked up the serum in Cochrines. By January 29th, the serum had reached the town of Ruby. It was the home of Bill McCarty, the 9th musher in the run.
The word came over the telegraph station there in Ruby that they needed mushers to relay this serum run on to a gnome. And my dad at the time was kind of like a handler, you know, he took care of the dogs.
The fellow that owned the dogs, he said, "You want to take a little ride? Go on down 28 miles. I said, all right. It was getting dark. I'd never been down that way on the trail before, and I took a flashlight. I had to run to keep warm. Yeah, I wouldn't feed the dogs at night. They wouldn't travel so well with a belly full.
Somewhere along the stretch there, he ran into a whiteout. It was kind of scary. It comes right into your face and you couldn't see where you're going. He just relied on this leader. This leader's name was Prince.
The dogs, you had to totally understand them. If a dog goes over one trail, you take him over that same trail 5 years later and he won't lose the trail. A dog never forgets.
"30 miles down the river, another musher was waiting.
My dad, Edgar Noller, was a young man when they asked him to run that serum run. He started from Whiskey Creek, which is about 25 miles behind me up on the river there. He said that as he was going along, when you look at these dogs, there's steam coming from this dog's breath. I had 7 dogs, just like wolves. 5 gray ones and 2 black ones. You couldn't even see them dogs, just like smoke.
As he neared the village of Galena, Edgar saw his brother George waiting.
He told his leader, Colonel G, to do a about face like, and George got on the sled and kept on going down to Bishop Mountain.
As George Nollner and the team raced down the river, the northern lights began to dance overhead. George had told his brother that he wanted to make the run because he had a girlfriend in the next town. The 12th musher in the relay, Charlie Evans, was waiting at Bishop Mountain. The grandson of one of the last great Athabascan chiefs, Evans was just 22.
I just jumped my dogs and moved up to Bishop Mountain, little cabin there, and started a fire. I waited all night till 4 o'clock in the morning, and the team came down. There was a letter passed down onto the package. It says to bring the medicine in and warm it up at every stop. And a little package about 18 or 20 pounds in the way. Warm it up by the stove. And I just slowed it up and went back down the river.
Evans' destination was just 30 miles down the Yukon. But now, the temperature had dropped even further, reaching a devastating 64 below. In such conditions, exposed skin blisters, lungs become scorched. As Evans made his way, he could hear the sound of trees cracking, popping like pistol shots.
Most people don't drive dogs that cold. He didn't really push them or anything, just let them go at their own pace. Let them go at a trotting pace, at their own speed. That way you don't hurt them.
"10 miles into his run, Evans came to the place where the Koyukuk River flows into the Yukon. Deceptively beautiful, it was as dangerous as a minefield. The fast-running, suppressed waters of the converging rivers had eroded away the surface ice.
So you're going along, and pretty soon you feel the whole work starting to sink, just kind of collapsing under the weight of the team and yourself.
You get wet, you freeze up real fast. You get to a point where you can't take care of yourself or your dogs. If you fall into the river, it sweeps you right under the ice and you're gone.
Evans had to wind his way around the open water, carefully dodging the exposed ice. But a few miles later, his 2 lead dogs began to stiffen up. Then both dogs collapsed. With no other options, Charlie Evans hitched himself to the team and helped pull the sled. He had become his own lead dog. By January 30th, 3 days into the run, the serum was in the hands of the last Athabascan musher, Jack Nicolai. Small, muscular, and tough, he was legendary throughout the Yukon, known simply by his nickname, Jack Screw. It was growing dark as Jack Screw began to traverse the Kaltag Divide. Finally, at 9 p.m., he saw a light piercing the darkness, a lantern hanging outside the cabin called Old Woman's Shelter. Jack's crew waited inside. Soon he heard the sounds of an approaching sled. It was Victor Anagik, a native Inupiat Eskimo who had been sent from a village on the coast to meet the serum. Together, Jack's crew and Anagik warmed the serum in front of the fire. The serum was still 240 miles away from Nome, and now there were 16 suspected cases. Dr. Welsh had rationed the expired antitoxin, but there was almost none left.
I was brought to the hospital. I had a very high fever, and I was giving 6,000 units of antitoxin. My second brother, Goodman, was probably the next to get sick. And then Johnny. Mother was very sick, and the doctor wanted her to have what serum there was left, and she refused to take it because she wanted Johnny to have it. So Johnny got the last of what serum there was, and Mother had to wait for the new serum to arrive.
There was no guarantee they were going to make it, and that fueled the story, coupled with the belief that if the diphtheria outbreak wasn't stopped, that it could spread to every village along the coast of the Bering Sea.
This is a period of the introduction of the tabloid newspaper and this mushrooms as editors pick it up and add their own twists to it.
Unable to get photos from the frozen north, some newspaper editors created their own.
The newspapers were put together rapidly, they were put together hurriedly. Whoever was writing the headlines or laying out the stories in New York, Boston, would be relying on the information they obtained from someone in Alaska.
On the morning of January 30th, Governor Bone received a private query from the Universal News Syndicate in California. "Please rush picturesque story," it said. "Would like dope about famous mushers. Will pay good rate."
Essentially, what the telegram invites him to do is to create the story, to imagine what was going to happen.
Bone had received periodic updates on the westward relay by telegraph, but no one had heard from Leonard Seppala, who was now 2 days into his journey east. Bone wrote about the champion musher anyway.
In a race for life, Leonard Seppala, the most famous musher of the Northland, has skirted Norton Sound and crossed the tundra overland to Kaltag.
In fact, the relay of other mushers had long since passed Kaltag and would soon reach the coast. Though they were each told to expect Seppala's approach at any point, he was nowhere to be seen. On the morning of January 31st, the Eskimo musher Victor Anagik carried the serum through the Kaltag portage, across open tundra, climbing as the trail followed the twists and turns of hill-borne streams. Then, just before sunrise, he finally descended until he reached the Bering Sea. The serum had now traveled more than half the distance to Nome in just over 3 days. But the trail would undergo dramatic changes. The mushers would now have to battle the legendary howling winds along the exposed, treeless shoreline of the frozen ocean. By late morning, 28-year-old Eskimo Miles Ganongnan had the serum safely in his sled. In Shaktoolik, Henry Ivanov, a half-Russian, half-Eskimo musher, was waiting.
My dad had his team ready. They just handed from one sled to the other sled. He took off before he even had time to drink up a hot coffee. That's what he said.
Just as Ivanov set out, Leonard Seppala, who had already mushed 43 miles since morning, was approaching Shaktoolik from the north.
When Leonard Seppala left Nome, he thought that he was doing this whole halfway distance and back on his own. And so he was making his way, thinking he was going to be going up the Yukon River towards Biloto, and he hears this shouting, and he sees a man, waving his arms.
Surprise, surprise, the serum's there. He really didn't expect the serum to be there.
With the serum in hand, Seppala and the team turned around and began to retrace their route back to Nome. After just a few miles, they came to the shoreline of Norton Sound. The shortest route to Nome lay in a northwest course straight across the Sound. But a storm was brewing, and Seppala would be mushing through 20 miles of open, wind-swept ice. Seppala had received a warning from Mark Summers, his boss at the mine. With the lives of the entire population of Nome at stake, speed was secondary to safety. Under no circumstance was Seppala ever to put the serum at risk. Now he faced a hard decision.
The sun is setting. It's getting darker. It's getting colder. The wind is building. Seppala's looking out. He tells Togo, let's go. Togo puts that first foot out on Norton Sound, and they begin to cross.
They were given orders, go on land, do not cross Norton Sound because it's high risk. He disobeyed my father's orders.
Seppala tried to listen for the telltale crack of ice breaking, but he could only hear the constant roar of the wind. Seppala now would have to trust the more basic instincts of Togo.
Togo was a 12-year-old dog. This is ancient for a race dog. But he had been through all kinds of things with Seppala. There was a real bond between them.
The wind is blowing into their face, sweeping the snow right off the ice. Seppala is desperate to get off this water. He got to Isaac's Point and put the dogs up at an Eskimo kennel for the night.
When they woke up in the morning, all that ice that they had crossed was gone. Had all floated out to sea.
Though the storm was growing, Seppala set out again. For 13 hours he mushed on. He had covered more than 200 miles in all. He would now hand the serum over to another musher.
It's not a mystery that when he finally did make it back to Golovin, that he was bushed, and his dogs were bushed.
The next musher, Charlie Olson, had a short run and by evening had reached the roadhouse in Bluff. Waiting inside was Gunnar Carson. Gunnar Carson, like Seppala, was a Norwegian immigrant and also worked for the Hammond Mining Company in Nome. Though at 43, he was only a few years younger than the famous musher, Carson worked as his assistant and was often overshadowed.
Gunnar was modest, kind of quiet, and stayed in his own area.
Once they decided that they needed more relay people from Golovin into Nome, they asked Carson if he could do it, but he did not have the team. So he went and asked Mrs. Seppala if he could take some dogs from Seppala's kennel. For some reason, he selected Balto.
Balto was just a freight dog. He belonged to Seppala, but Seppala felt he lacked sufficient speed, and Balto was never selected for his racing teams.
Balto was not as intelligent as Togo, not that much of a leader. He was a follower, a dependable dog.
It was 10 p.m. on the evening of February 1st when Carson, Balto, and the team started out. The blizzard had grown in intensity. Carson had never felt winds this heavy before.
The storm had gotten so bad that he couldn't even see his wheel dogs on the back of the team, which were right in front of the sled. He couldn't call directions to Balto as to where to go, where to turn, to gee or haw.
The storm attacked. Carson had no choice but to follow blindly and trust his leader. Then, 22 miles into the run at Bonanza Flats, disaster struck.
He hits some rough terrain, and combination terrain, wind, bad visibility, it flips his sled over. And he goes to upright the sled, and the serum is gone. It's blizzard conditions, very little light, and he's groping on the ground, takes his mittens off, tries to feel. It's dark. Amazingly, he found this bump on the ground that was the package, strapped it back on.
Sometime after 2 o'clock Sunday morning, Carson neared his destination, Point Safety. There he would hand over the serum to the last musher in the run, Ed Roan. Roan was also a Nome resident and, like Seppala, a champion racer. He owned the fastest dog team for short runs in the entire country and was an obvious choice for the final sprint. Just before dawn on February 2nd, a lone musher made his way up the beach toward Nome. At 5:30, he swung up onto Nome's deserted front street. Dr. Welch was startled awake by a pounding on his front door. He was stunned to see that the serum had made it through the blizzard. But moreover, he was shocked to see who the musher was. The entire town had expected to welcome Ed Roan. Instead, before him stood Gunnar Carson.
And so what did Gunner Casson do? Instead of stopping at safety to let Ed Rohn have the last run in, he didn't stop, he just kept coming.
The story I've heard was the lights were out at the cabin.
He thought, why should I take that precious time to wait for this musher to get up, to get dressed, get the dogs harnessed, when I'm already going, we're almost there.
But I can see Gunner Kaysen. I can see his mind. You know, the only guy they're gonna really appreciate is the guy that puts the serum in the doctor's hands.
At the Signal Corps office, the wires buzzed with queries from the press about the unexpected musher and, in particular, his dogs. Carson's team had arrived with a double lead. Balto had been paired with another dog, Fox, for the final push into Nome.
One newspaper reporter didn't want to use the name Fox because he thought the readers would be confused that a fox was leading the dog team into Nome. So he said to Gunner, what's the name of your other lead dog? He said, that's Balto. He says, I'll use Balto. That'll be the name I'll use in my story.
Local cameramen rushed out to Front Street to take photographs and even film footage of Carson and Balto. But as the media celebrated the new heroes of the serum run, the town of Nome was still in crisis.
The first amount of serum that arrives is only about a quarter of what the doctor had said was needed. So now Bone has to do the serious work of getting more serum out of Seattle, getting it up to Anchorage, getting it on the train, and getting it up to Nenana, and more dog sleds. And this is when Thompson thought that he had a great opportunity to get in on it.
The optimism we registered yesterday is a mess of pessimism for Nome tonight. The airship way is the only way.
Thompson's trying to build up his story. He rallies folks to contribute money in Fairbanks to pay for the fuel. And he's in touch with Washington, trying to generate pressure.
Thompson's persistence was rewarded. The U.S. Public Health Service overrode the governor. Of the new batch of 1 million units of antitoxin, half would go by dog team and half by air. On February 8th, the second relay took off on schedule from Nenana with half of the serum. Some of the same drivers participated. In Fairbanks, the other half of the serum was packaged and ready to go. Thompson and his mechanics scrambled to get their plane in the air.
They were really trying hard to get an airplane ready, but they were having one problem after another problem with it.
The dogs were a full 2 days ahead by the time the plane was finally ready to take off.
They turn on the magnetos and the guy gets out there to prop the airplane. Big prop, and it gets halfway down, and there's a backfire, and it threw the guy 10 feet into the air.
It's a complete disaster, and they can't pull it off. They can't do anything.
But the relay of dog teams was averaging a steady 10 miles per hour. The new batch of serum was due to arrive in just a few days. W.F. Thompson wrote a rueful editorial.
All the world likes to put in with the winner and laugh at the loser. The only satisfaction is that we have never worried whether you laughed with us or at us, so long as you laugh. The airship will go on when it can. We take our hat off to the dog.
Ed Rohn, the driver Gunnar Carson had bypassed the first time, ran the final leg of the relay. He arrived in Nome on the evening of February 15th. The serum was quickly put to use. 6 days later, Dr. Welch lifted the quarantine. It was almost exactly a month since the first diagnosis. On June 4th, 1925, under sunny skies, hundreds of Nome's residents crowded the shores of the Bering Sea. The town welcomed the SS Victoria, the first ship of the season. That spring, the eagerly awaited first photographs of the serum run finally appeared in newspapers around the country. Screenings of the film footage followed shortly thereafter. A few weeks later, on a snowy mountain just outside of Seattle, Gunnar Carson and his team once again reenacted their run, this time for Hollywood cameras. Balto's Race to Nome toured the lower 48. At the end of each screening, Gunnar Carson would step out on stage, then, to great applause, out would trot Balto.
Balto, the hero of the serum run, was a piker. And the reason he didn't go with Seppala was that he wasn't good enough. It does explain Leonard Seppala's bitterness right to the very end of his days. Togo wasn't statuized. Togo didn't have movies made of him. This was the last really significant run that dog would make. And to come to an end of his career and then to be outshone by some second-rater, I think there was some real authentic remorse over that.
The serum run heralded the end of the dog sled era. On the very day the antitoxin was delivered, the U.S. Congress passed the Kelly Act, which encouraged the awarding of mail contracts to commercial airplane companies. The publicity from the Nome epidemic also focused attention on the importance of inoculation, and soon diphtheria was relegated to a minor position on the nation's roster of dread diseases. But Alaska still struggled in its fight against illness. Though Dr. Welch's official report indicated only 5 fatalities from the epidemic that winter, native deaths were never scrupulously recorded.
I remember the death of a woman who lived across the way on the Sandspit from diphtheria. She was Eskimo, and this was, of course, in February.
Only a few years after the serum run, the Eskimo village of Sinuk, just 50 miles up the coast from Nome, was wiped out by illness. The town disappeared, without mention in the newspapers. By 1926, Balto and 6 other dogs had been sold, and soon found themselves virtual prisoners far from the snowy tundra in Sam Houston's Dimer-Loch Museum of Oddities.
They're put in this hot little room in hot Los Angeles, and they're hooked up to their gang harness most of the time, on display, with not a lot of people going in and out of there. They start to lose weight, their fur gets matted, they are basically neglected to almost to death.
But the dog's fame would prove to be their savior.
Here's dog team pulling Alaskan sleigh through streets of Cleveland, Ohio. In lead is Balto, hero of fantastic drive to snowbound, ice-imprisoned city of Nome when that Arctic metropolis was struck by epidemic.
In 1927, a traveling salesman from Cleveland happened upon the sideshow and was moved to take action. With the help of the Cleveland Plain dealer, the citizens and children of the city raised $2,200 to rescue the dogs.
So they brought the dogs to the Cleveland Zoo, and they lived out their natural lives. And when Balto died, he was stuffed, and to this day is in the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Every so many years, they bring him out, dust him off, and they have a big deal.
There are still no roads that link Nome and the interior native villages to the rest of Alaska. The town, and much of the surrounding region, remains largely unchanged. The legend of the Serum Run lingers, but as a faded memory.
We would like to think that history is a thing that exists and we access it. No, 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 no. History is a thing we construct out of an incredibly imperfect, fallible, piecemeal record, which is incredibly dependent on whatever piece of information got documented and whatever piece of information somebody thinks they remember.